So the global financial crisis may have been triggered by defaulting subprime loans, but that's not really the root cause of the problem. The problem is actually the monetary system itself. It's been the bank's ability to create more and more debt which has prevented the system from collapsing. But the question has to be asked, at what point can we not afford to borrow anymore? And the evidence that suggests that we've reached that tipping point is the fact that we citizens of the Western world, now maxed out, are passing the baton to the Western governments of the world. Now, here's the projected borrowing for 2009. $5.3 trillion worth of new debt. Our governments have taken hold of the reins and they're going to borrow like never before. Borrowing and spending like mad in order to create enough new debt to pay the interest on the existing money supply. People got into this mess by going into massive debt, and the government is trying to fix things by going into massive debt. All in the name of Keynesian deficit spending. You got stimulus and bailouts and Kevin Rudd's mailing out $900 checks. If the citizens can't continue borrowing, the government must do it for them. How is it possible, I wonder, to borrow ourselves out of a debt problem? This is the reality of the pathetic situation that we're in right now. Have you ever tried to drink yourself sober? Once you grasp a real understanding of the true nature of the monetary system, you just scratch your head in disbelief. Now that you've got a basic understanding of the debt-based monetary system, let's take a look at the US dollar. It's really the backbone of the system, given that it holds the reserve currency status. You can see here the nations of the world hold the majority of their reserves in US dollars. So a run on the dollar would pose a huge threat to the global economy. When Nixon shut the gold window in 1971, the dollar was no longer convertible to gold. A few short years after, the US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger brokered a deal with the royal family of Saudi Arabia, the largest oil producer in the OPEC cartel, and they agreed to sell oil only in US dollars. Now this was key in cementing the US dollar's reserve status after the gold peg was broken. And from that point, every nation that needed to buy oil needed to get their hands on US dollars. So they basically just traded their goods and services for the US dollars which America just created out of thin air. And so this is America's predicament. Over the past 38 years, they've become more and more dependent on imports as they began offshoring their real industry and paying for those finished goods with debt. This chart shows that America became a net importer in the mid-70s. Now at the top you can see what was once a trade surplus, now a big deficit. And down the bottom you can see the divergence of America's imports and exports as a percentage of GDP. And this is the end result, the trade balance with China. Foreign countries exporting to the US are paid in dollars. They would then lend these dollars back to the US government to fund the deficit. So it started with the Saudis in what became termed petrodollar recycling. And then we saw it later as the Japanese and, well, eventually the Chinese became the hub of world manufacturing. And this is how it works. China makes stuff for America, America pays in US dollars. China lends the dollars back to America by purchasing US treasuries. America end up with the goods and their money back, while the Chinese end up holding paper promises that can't be paid. China has amassed $720 billion worth of US Treasury debt in this fashion. Not to mention all the agency debt like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, which you can see here in the beige colour. US corporations have outsourced and offshored everything from production plants to call centres, and as that offshoring spread, the American cities and states lost their tax base, and now all bar one of the 50 American states are teetering on bankruptcy. The US industry was once a powerhouse of manufacturing and skilled machine-tooled labour, has all but rotted out in favour of a debt-based consumer economy of consumerism and banking. So you can see here from this chart that the American economy is now based 70% on consumption. Only the bad news is that consumption was funded by debt. That's what you call a post-industrial economy, and it's a failure. Americans, now lacking any real industry, became accustomed to going heavily into debt and making fast cash by flipping real estate. The real estate bubble gave them further access to debt as they ripped the newfound equity out of their homes to spend on consumption. The US economy has been hollowed out to a point where there is actually no capacity to produce the real wealth required to pay its debts. It must simply run the printing press faster and faster as the debts just pile up. Now let's take a closer look at the numbers. We've already seen the US trade deficit, but I wanted to point out on the top chart the sharp retreat in the deficit in this past year. Now that's not because America's producing more. It's because the American consumer is broke and they can't get access to debt, which enables them to consume. So this signals a potential threat because America's trade partners won't have the surplus dollars available to recycle and fund America's budget deficit spending. This is the federal budget deficit, which came in at around 1.4 trillion in the fiscal year 2009. Now that's 3 times the deficit of fiscal year 2008. You can see here in red, going forward, they're not exactly realistic forecasts. Next we've got the national debt. Now this chart's about 2 years old. It was 9 trillion then. It's now well off the top of the chart at about $11.5 trillion. The national debt clock, displayed just around the corner from Times Square in New York, nearly lost its dollar sign when the debt ticked over 10 trillion in September 2008. They didn't have enough space to fit the extra digit, so they just kicked the dollar sign off the end. There you go. $11 trillion. It's unbelievable. It's like a debt bomb that's about to go up in smoke. I mean, take a look at the Fed's balance sheet. It's also looking fairly swollen. And of course there's still more. This is the elephant in the room. America's unfunded liabilities now total over $80 trillion. And that's made up of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid obligations. The bulge in the population, known as baby boomers, will begin to retire over the coming few years. And this ageing population is going to result in fewer workers supporting more retirees. Social Security and Medicare are just another example of Ponzi scheme economics. See, what goes in the front door goes straight out the back. It's unfunded. So whilst there's more being paid into Social Security than going out, the scales are projected to tip in a few years when these baby boomers move into retirement. You can see the cash deficit problems for Social Security and Medicare on this chart. Only, again, the chart's outdated. It's from 2007. So with the ongoing collapse of America's physical economy, their unemployment rate is climbing rapidly, which means less contributions to these programs. So the chart grossly underestimates the blowout in these liabilities. The end result is evident in this chart here, only again it's an old chart. It's from 2005. So all the stimulus and spending that you've seen over the last 12 months is going to be added to the green section here. You can see the unfunded liabilities in red, yellow and blue, and they're about to blow sky high. So with the increased spending in the green section, the chart has ramped up a lot faster than this chart shows. And I can assure you that America's liabilities are not going to be able to be repaid legitimately. The dollar's reserve currency status has been America's free lunch, but it appears that the game's nearly up because the rest of the world has realised that the US debt will only be repaid in freshly printed dollars. More debt.